Hey, gang. Back in the shed for another conversation on the subject of integrity. So, the last time that I talked on here, I was discussing integrity from the perspective of the self and understanding yourself properly, respecting and understanding your true limitations in the world, rejecting the hero narrative, which is unhelpful, which treats the self as though it has sovereignty over the outcomes of all things, as though it is the chief player in your story, because it gives you a false perspective of what's going on in your life. And that may sound harsh. It's certainly not something that most people, myself included, wants to admit, is that there are forces totally outside of our control that exert a great deal more influence on what's going to happen in our life than we are. And I'm not talking just about world powers, because hypothetically you could come to a position of great power inside of that structure, even over that structure, which still requires that people participate in your power. But like gravity, like death, these are things that you can't conquer. You can only work within the rules that govern them. So, I was talking about trying to do good in the present within your spheres of control, within your spheres of influence. Even seeking to expand those to a degree is good. Um, but then we come up with that hard wall of understanding, which is what is good? Is there good? And how can we know? Um, as I'd said, I'm going to try and tackle the concept of God here and how we can know there is a God, is an objective truth. But to do that, I want to try and contribute something that's useful to you, because I know there are many voices, and many of them are a lot smarter and wiser than I am, trying to converse on this idea of how we can know if there is a God and how we can know who that God is. And you understand, if you've been listening to me at all, that I am coming at this from the perspective of a Christian. I am a Christian. I am a man who believes there is a literal spirit that is God the Father, and that there is a literal person named Jesus Christ who literally lived, literally died, literally rose again, that he ascended into heaven, that he is symbolically the most important man that ever lived. He's also literally the most important man that ever lived. And you may question why I would believe that, or how I could possibly stand on a truth that I can't objectively prove. And what I want to challenge you with is what you're using for your metrics for objective proof, if that's where you stand. And I want to challenge you on your understanding of whether or not we can actually know whether there is an objective good or evil. So I'm going to start here just with a little story. So when we showed up in Kandahar in 2007, there about, I think, 2 weeks maybe. I was there about 2 weeks in country when our commanding officer had actually just left my camp and was heading east on the main road, came to a place in Kandahar, which is right coming into Kandahar city, and there's a bridge there. As he was driving up to the bridge in his vehicle with his crew, and of course a convoy behind him of other support vehicles, there was a guy standing in the roadway. And this man stood there and didn't move when they stopped the vehicle. And then he started to walk towards the armored personnel carrier that the commanding officer was in. Young fella, he didn't respond to orders to halt. Um, the the commanding officer fired a round in his direction to try and warn him off, and he continued to walk forward, and then he shot him with a machine gun until he stopped moving. Why did he do that? He did that because there are people in Afghanistan at that time, and still today, that are convinced to put bombs on their bodies and go and kill other people by blowing themselves up, by sneaking up to enemies of Allah and blowing themselves up in order to wage war against unbelievers, enemies of Allah. So he killed him a lot. And I was the QRF, I was the quick response force that I took my guys out from the camp and went and cordoned off the area and waited for EOD to come, the explosive ordnance guys, to come and basically look for the explosives on the body and defuse a bomb if it was there. Talked to the commanding officer and his crew, and this fellow, I got the whole story of exactly how it went down. It was rough. Like, the lad was splattered all over the road, and he was very dead. And then the police came, and the police said to me, can we please collect that body? It's the police chief's nephew. Long story short, I had to talk to the police chief of Zari district of Kandahar, where I was stationed. He was actually co-located with me afterwards, and obviously he was really broken about that, and it was somebody that he loved, somebody that was close to him. His nephew is mentally handicapped, like autistic, and obviously, long story short, there was no bomb. Probably what happened, based on the evidence, is that the Taliban or affiliates, jihadists, they had given him money and said, we'll give you more money if you go and walk up and walk up to that vehicle when it comes. So he, with no comprehension of what was going on, went and did what he was asked to do, and he got killed for it. He was killed so that it would create a divide between the police chief and us. He was killed to try and hopefully cause other casualties of civilians and innocents when he was shot down. And he was killed to make us look foolish. Is convincing a mentally handicapped 15 or 16-year-old man to walk into the fire of an enemy so that people will dislike the person who shot him, is that good? Scraping his body up was something that I don't think was good. I didn't think this is a good use of human life. Of course, there were real suicide bombers. They, young guys, vehicle suicide bombers, and generally they blew themselves up in crowds of people. I never had to get in close with that, fortunately, and by God's grace. But they would generally position themselves in a place where they could make sure there were a lot of children and civilian casualties when they blew up, so they could then blame that on us for having made them do it, and they'd take pictures and circulate that. Is that good? Do you think that if I walked into your house and killed your daughter or sister or mother, would you think this is good? See, we like to have these conversations on some kind of philosophical, theoretical level. Um, People have often tried to argue with me that we know that good is subjective because it's only a function of our nurture that we're taught certain things are good. And that's why these suicide bombers would do something like that because that's what they were taught and so they do it. Yeah, you know, the reason that we are trained to recognize suicide bombers by looking for the sweaty, pasty faced guy who's panicking is because it sounds really good till you go to do it, and then you can recognize them by the fact that they are terrified and muttering prayers as they go to blow themselves up, and they're questioning the goodness of what they're doing. Um, People will use the example that child soldiers that are raised to rape and kill from the youngest of ages don't have any conscience. They're terribly broken people. Like what you're saying doesn't bear out because if you actually talk to those people, they're just shattered, broken, non-functional people because evil has its effect upon the life of the person who participates in it. And even being in the vicinity, like, why do you think that PTSD is a thing for soldiers who are in the midst of combat? It's because you talk about trauma. Yeah, well, it's trauma, but why is it traumatic? What's traumatic about death? What's traumatic about the guilt that comes from having done something which you didn't intend to do or didn't think would be what it was? It's the confrontation with evil and the horror of it. It's the betrayal. Like most of the people that I talk to, from former colleagues and peers that are suffering from deep psychological trauma, it's tied very closely to the thought that they went to go do things that they thought were going to be good, but then they found out that that wasn't maybe what we were there to do. Like the reality was that maybe doing all those things and losing our friends and killing people for a better softwood lumber deal with the United States wasn't so good. And so there's an anguish that's tied to that. I guess I am super ranting here, I know, but we actually don't need to be convinced that there is good and evil. What you need to do, what you are doing if you're denying that, is you're actually trying to convince yourself that your natural instinct for good and evil is a figment of your imagination. You're just lying to yourself and trying to deny the objectivity of it. And why? How can you justify that? The only way you can justify that is turning to philosophies that are drawn out of the Renaissance Enlightenment, and you go to empiricism and you say, well, proofs the only proofs that I will accept are the ones which can be empirically measured by my five senses. If it can't be seen, if it can't be sighted, if it can't be seen, smelt, felt, tasted, or heard, yeah, wow, well done, Neil. If it can't be one of those things, then I don't accept that it can possibly be measured and therefore is not objectively true. Well, why are you restricting your conscience as though that weren't a sense? Why do you reject the possibility that if everybody universally recognizes that mortality is a bad thing, that if everybody universally has an instinct that says abusing people is bad, even if they can sear that conscience, it's in them, and your childhood memories attest to your first reality, your first reactions to brutality, and how that made you feel, um, even if you've since seared your conscience to it. Like, why is that not a sense? Why are you rejecting that? We universally recognize these things. There's a reason why the universalists can actually point to the golden rule being reflected on some level around the world in that principle of love your neighbor as yourself. You see it in every society. Why? Well, because you need that to function as humans. When you reject the principles of morality, your society falls apart. And I want to challenge anyone who's questioning, you know, again, I'm not even going to sit here and talk about whether there is a God. Functionally, yes, there is a God. I could talk to you about Paul Vanderklay does a great thing if you're not familiar with him, where he kind of tears this down into God 1 and God 2, and he says, there is the God of the systems, God 1, that is the moral ethical framework, the uh, physical framework of the world, which is outside of ourselves, the hierarchies of governance, the physical constants, Planck's constant, the law of gravity, all of these things that operate on you, that are sovereign over you, that you don't get to control. Those are, even in themselves, if there's nothing governing them, those are God, right? But they aren't gods. They're God's attributes imposed upon his creation. But even if they were all that there were, that would be a God of a kind, the God of the systems. The thing you're actually struggling with is a willingness to accept that there is the God to the personal God, or that if you accept that that may be, how do I know which one it is? Well, trust your instincts. Trust that these things are actually possible to understand. Read the texts of these different approaches to God and see which one actually reflects the true God, which can, if I use that as my foundation stone for my integrity, which one will pour out the things that I instinctively recognize are good and true? Is it the one that leads to the suicide bomber? Is it the one that leads to tricking retarded kids into going and getting themselves shot to pieces to make Canadians look bad? Is it the one that abducts children and makes them kill their own parents and then rape, participate in acts of rape even before they hit sexual maturity to participate, so that they're completely broken psychologically into these deranged sociopathic killers that just can't interface with the world? Is that faith the one that objectively seems good to you? Just take a step back and have a look at these systems, because you know what doesn't produce good is empiricism or rationalism, right? These ideas they're not leading to anything good. We thought, the argument was that we're going to reject religion, which is the source of all wrong and bad and conflict, and then with pure reason, we will overcome all of these limitations, and we will exalt ourselves as man above. We called ourselves gods. That's what rationalism actually is. It's choosing to be God. That's what empiricism is. It says, if I can't perceive or measure it, it isn't true, because I am the only God that I will recognize. But those things have led to some of the most vile, broken societies that the world has ever known. I mean, rationalism is the root of the French Revolution. Wasn't that great? We call it the Reign of Terror not because it was a fun time for anybody. It sucked for everybody. The people who overthrew their tyrannical overlords, granted, the French nobility was nothing great, but the thing that followed out of rationalism was somehow much worse, right? The communist ideology of Marx, or the socialist ideology of Marx, um, these ideologies came out of a rejection of God and an approach to create a rational society based on the premise that human beings were capable when rejecting all tradition of being good. The proof is in the pudding. The most bloody, violent, murderous societies that have ever existed on this globe are the rationalist communist societies. Like the body count is in, guys, and they are officially the worst murderers of humankind that have ever existed. Right? Now, that doesn't mean necessarily that, okay, rationalism is bad and Christianity, well, it has the Crusades, so, and it's had its 30 Years' War, which was a pretty brutal and atrocious conflict between the Protestants and the Catholics. Therefore, we need something better, something that doesn't derive itself from those Christian principles. Well, two things. War is not a Christian principle. War is what happens in Christendom. Sorry, not that war is wrong, but religious conquest is not a Christian principle. Conversion by violence is explicitly contrary to Christian principles. So whenever it has been exercised, it is because a world power has chosen to exploit Christian faith, contrary to the principles of Christianity, to get people to do things that were good for the power that was using religion instead of actually observing it. So that matters. But if you want to talk about going back to the old ways, because a lot of folks are trying to turn to paganism, like, take a hard look, folks. Paganism is a brutal, meaningless, violent place to be. Historically, if you want anything that ever had less value of human life than communism, it's probably any form of paganism. And I challenge you, if you think that you find great wisdom in the Vedas and the Hindi practices, to actually take a hard look at what it looks like to be in that society with its caste system and all of the neglect of human worth that comes out of that whole worldview. Read The Book That Made Your World by Vishal Mangalwadi. Yes, Vishal Mangalwadi, The Book That Made Your World, from the perspective of somebody who grew up in Hindi Indian society, who looks at it from the outside and says, you don't understand that your Western security comes from the Bible. And this is what it looks like, what I knew growing up, to live under the superstitions of Hindu faith. It's not what you think it is, right? And when you talk about shamanism, understand that shamanistic societies, without the support of Western first world social structures, have not generally worked out that great. Challenge yourself honestly to reflect upon these things. Shamanistic society goes to the worship of the spirits and animistic gods, and it's animalistic. It's tribal down to the most basic root whenever it's actually expressed in the world. And psychedelics is the means of truth. Like, what psychedelic shamanistic society has actually been a place you want to live in? Truly. Get over your romanticism. Look at the tenets of Christianity. Be honest with yourself. This world is a brutal, bloody, awful place, and humans have terrible capacity for evil. They just do. You do, and I do. And one of those principles that Jordan Peterson taught, which is absolutely true, is you have to recognize that you and I both have the capacity to be Auschwitz guards with no great concern for human life. We have that capacity. We can kill all that we recognize as good in ourselves and pursue the path of evil. We can grow into that and become that destroyer quite easily if we just surrender ourselves to apathy and to a rejection of objective truth. We're there. Like, we live in societies that have stopped concerning ourselves with the lives of the elderly. We've stopped concerning ourselves with the lives of the unborn because we don't believe they actually have any meaning. They don't exist. They're not real lives. And then you start to ask the question of, does human life have value? What objective truth leads to a conclusion that it does have value? Well, there's only one, which is that God created human life and he values it. So you may have a difficulty accepting the possibility that there is a God who deserves your worship. You may say that's selfish and foolish and childish. Why would he need it? It's not the point. He doesn't need it. But there is a creator God. He is the source of good. He is that which is the contrast to evil. Evil is everything which is contrary to his nature. He is the architect, and everything that is good is drawn from his nature. This is the Christian truth. This is the truth that says God is in himself good and the source of all good. All of those attributes you long for, virtue, love, peace, goodness, the relational goodness between yourself and others. The relational God is God who is three persons, who has always been in relationship and wants relationship with you. That is the God who can lead you to productive goodness towards others. The God who actually created man to have relationship with him to his own glory, and actually desired relationship with you enough that he would give of himself in the person of Christ to be joined with this creation, to be a man, not just figuratively or symbolically, but literally, and to go and to walk as a man and to die as a man on the behalf of those under him, like the good senior officer, take the punishment for your sins so that you could come to know God. This is Christianity. There are no victims in Christianity. It is not an apathetic religion. There are only conquerors in Christianity. Do you want a part of that? Do you want to know what good is? Then go to God through Christ. I don't need to prove that he exists. You just need to ask him. If you're bold enough, if you got the parts, then step up and talk to God and ask him to show you himself through his son. And if you doubt that he's real, then ask him to show himself to you. Start actually challenging yourself to get over your revisionist history attempts to find anything other than Christ. Anything. And how many people do I talk to that are looking for any other answer? I'll accept the shamanistic stuff. I'll accept paganism. I'll accept the materialism. I'll accept symbolism. I'll accept alchemy. Anything that doesn't require me to turn to Christ and acknowledge him as the Lord and the only option I have of actually knowing God. The fact that you don't want to do it is pretty hard proof that there's something real there. Turn to him, look to him, explore it, examine the truth. I don't care if it's empirically verifiable or not. We all know that it's true. And you can question me and say, well, you don't know, you were raised in it. Fine, I was raised in a Christian worldview. Appreciate that the Christian worldview is now one which is growing like wildfire in China and in Iran and in India and in Africa and in all of these places where other cultures somehow grab a hold of it and recognize it as truth. That your concept, if you have it, that the church is dying is hilariously untrue. That in fact the church is growing faster today than it ever has been. Just because the West has dulled their senses to it doesn't mean that the church has stopped growing. People are turning to Christ all over the world, and they are finding truth. And they are finding the ability to build a foundation for truth that gives them the ability to face the world as it is with power. And I tell you all this stuff, guys, because my life is one of watching people self destruct with useless worldviews that are powerless to help them. They turn to the mental health for drugs to numb their senses. They turn to mental health for coping mechanisms and breathing systems that will allow them to control but never be healed from anxiety and just endure to the end. And all I can tell you is this thing that I have is real, it has actual power, and it is able to equip you to do good for yourself and for others. And it also happens to be true eternal good. I have faced a lot of different hardships in the world. Not the most as anyone that's been on here, but I've been in the dark places, guys. This is true and good and powerful to resist these things and to overcome them. So there it is. God is everything. He's worthy. That's why I serve him. Maybe you should consider the possibility of accepting that there is good. It is objective because it is in God. And then you might be able to start finding ways to overcome the difficulties and the challenges that are seemingly impossible to overcome in your life. All right, cheers. That's my rant for now. Comments, complaints, or questions, throw them down below, and I will be happy to respond to you. Peace out.